When Matthew Jameson, a new homeowner in a quiet suburb, was accused of trespassing on his own property, it wasn't just a mistake, it was blatant prejudice. The leader of the neighborhood watch didn't just question him, she called the police, convinced he couldn't possibly belong there. But armed with determination and undeniable proof, Matthew turned humiliation into a powerful stand against injustice. And wait until you see how this story unfolded and why justice, in the end, prevailed in the most unexpected way. Saturday morning began with the kind of tranquility Matthew Jameson had always imagined for himself. After years of grinding away in a cramped city apartment, the sprawling suburban home with its wraparound porch and lush yard felt like a dream finally realized. The property, crowned by a magnificent oak tree at its center, was more than just a house. It was a testament to his hard work, a place where he could breathe, create, and simply exist without the chaos of his past life. As the morning sun poured over the neighborhood, Matthew found solace in routine. Clad in a faded t-shirt and jeans, he worked on the shrubs lining his property's white picket fence. His movements were deliberate and meditative, the sharp snip of his pruning shears breaking the silence every so often. The scent of freshly cut greenery mingled with the crisp air, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. That serenity was interrupted by the crunch of gravel under tires. Matthew glanced up to see a white SUV rolling to a halt just outside his driveway. The vehicle stood out. It was spotless and far too polished for an impromptu visit. From it emerged three people, two men and a woman, all wearing identical navy t-shirts with a bold Neighborhood Watch logo emblazoned across the chest. The woman, likely in her 50s, had an air of authority about her, her sharp gaze locked on Matthew as though he were an anomaly. She stepped forward with purpose, her voice cutting through the calm like a blade. "Excuse me, what exactly are you doing here?" Matthew straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans, more puzzled than defensive. "I'm just tending to my yard. Can I help you with something?" Her expression hardened, her brows knitting together, as if his response had only confirmed her suspicions. "Your yard?" she repeated, her tone dripping with incredulity. "I'm sorry, but this property belongs to a family that moved in recently. You're not them." Matthew blinked, stunned by the sheer audacity of her statement. "I am the family that moved in recently," he replied, his voice steady though his chest tightened. "This is my home." The woman's face contorted into something resembling disgust. She scanned him from head to toe, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Your home?" she echoed, her disbelief now teetering into accusation. "I don't think so. You don't look like the neighbors we were expecting." The words hit him like a slap, the underlying message unmistakable. He felt a cold wave ripple down his spine, followed quickly by a simmering anger. Still, he forced himself to remain composed. "I have all the paperwork if you'd like to see it," he offered, his voice tight but calm. Instead of responding, one of the men, tall, broad, and silent up until this point, pulled out his phone. Without so much as glancing at Matthew, he began dialing. "We're going to let the police sort this out," the man said, his tone dismissive, as if the matter was already settled in their favor. Matthew took a step back, disbelief giving way to a quiet fury. "Is this really necessary?" he asked, though it was clear his question fell on deaf ears. The woman crossed her arms, tilting her head in mock contemplation. "We have a responsibility to keep this neighborhood safe," she said, her gaze narrowing. "We can't just let strangers wander around unchecked." The implications stung worse than the words themselves. Strangers. Matthew's hands clenched involuntarily at his sides. He glanced around, noticing how curtains in nearby windows shifted, eyes peering out at the unfolding drama. Every gaze felt heavy, judgmental, like a silent jury deliberating his right to exist in this space. "This is harassment," he finally said, his voice tinged with exasperation. "You haven't even tried to hear me out. I've done nothing wrong." The man with the phone scoffed, shaking his head. "We don't take chances around here, not after everything that's happened in this city. You can explain yourself to the officers when they get here." Matthew's heart pounded in his chest as the weight of their assumptions bore down on him. This wasn't about property or safety. This was about the color of his skin, the unspoken prejudice that made them see him as an intruder rather than a neighbor. He stood his ground, determined to hold on to the dignity they seemed so eager to strip away. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. The pristine, picture-perfect suburb around him now cloaked in an unsettling tension. All he could do was wait. Wait for the police. Wait for this ordeal to end. Wait to prove once again that he belonged. Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens pierced the stillness of the street, growing louder as they approached Matthew's driveway. A black and white police cruiser pulled up with deliberate precision, its presence slicing through the tense atmosphere like a knife. Two officers, both wearing mirrored sunglasses and expressions of practiced indifference, stepped out of the vehicle. Their movements were calm, almost detached, as though this were just another routine call on a long list of neighborhood disputes. Matthew's heart sank as he realized they didn't so much as glance in his direction. Instead, their attention immediately shifted to the group from Neighborhood Watch, who stood clustered together with an air of self-righteous authority. The woman at the forefront, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, wasted no time in speaking up. "We called," she said briskly, her voice carrying a sharp edge. "There's a suspicious man on this property. He claims he lives here, but that's clearly not true." One of the officers nodded, jotting something down in his notepad before addressing her with a measured tone. "We received a call about a trespasser. What exactly did you observe?" The woman launched into an exaggerated retelling, her voice brimming with conviction. "He was tampering with the landscaping like he was casing the place. This neighborhood has had issues before, and we can't just stand by while something like this happens." Matthew couldn't believe what he was hearing. His breath hitched, but he forced himself to speak, keeping his voice steady. "Officer, this is my home. I can show you proof. My deed, my ID, whatever you need." But his words seemed to evaporate before they could reach the officers. One of them finally turned to look at him, his expression unreadable behind those mirrored lenses. "Do you have any evidence that you're not trespassing?" the officer asked, his tone flat, as if the burden of proof already rested squarely on Matthew's shoulders. Matthew's pulse quickened, a mixture of disbelief and frustration, bubbling just beneath the surface. "I've already said this is my property. Everything you need to confirm that is inside. If you'll allow me to—" The officer raised a hand, silencing him mid-sentence. "We'll get to that," he said curtly, before turning back to the Neighborhood Watch group. It was as if Matthew's words held no weight, no authority. The implication was clear. These neighbors, strangers to him, were more credible than he could ever be in their eyes. As the exchange unfolded, other residents began to emerge from their homes. First a curtain twitched, then a door opened, and soon small clusters of neighbors lined the sidewalks, murmuring to each other. Their gazes fell on Matthew, scrutinizing him like he was an unwelcome invader. The warmth and hospitality he had envisioned when he moved here were nowhere to be found. Instead, he felt their judgment like a physical weight pressing down on him. The whispers reached his ears in fragments, each word cutting deeper than the last. "Who is he? Does he even belong here? I knew something like this would happen." Matthew clenched his fists, his knuckles whitening as he tried to suppress the storm brewing inside him. The woman from the group turned to the gathering crowd, as if rallying support for her unfounded claims. "See?" she said, gesturing toward Matthew with dramatic flair. "This is exactly why we need to stay vigilant." Her words hung in the air, feeding the unease spreading through the onlookers. Matthew wanted to shout, to demand they see him for who he was, a homeowner, a neighbor, a human being, but he knew it would only make things worse. Anger would be twisted into aggression, frustration into guilt. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to speak again, though his voice cracked under the weight of suppressed emotion. "Officer, please, I have nothing to hide. Just let me prove it." The officer, still unmoved, exchanged a glance with his partner before finally giving a reluctant nod. "Fine, show us." Matthew moved toward the house, his steps heavy with a mix of humiliation and defiance. Behind him, the murmurs grew louder, the eyes of the crowd burning into his back. He felt their distrust like a tidal wave, threatening to drown him. For the first time since moving to this neighborhood, Matthew realized he wasn't seen as a part of it. To them, he wasn't a new neighbor or even a man tending to his yard. He was a stranger, an outsider, someone who didn't belong. The officer finally gave a curt nod, gesturing for Matthew to proceed. Matthew's heart pounded as he turned toward his front door, his every step feeling heavier under the weight of the crowd's stares. Inside, he moved swiftly but deliberately, retrieving the folder that held everything he needed: the deed, his ID, proof of his ownership and identity. These papers, products of years of sacrifice and success, were now his shield. Returning to the driveway, Matthew extended the documents to the officer, his hands steady despite the frustration simmering beneath his calm exterior. "Here," he said, his voice tight but controlled. "This is the deed to my home. My ID is here too. Please take a look." The officer silently examined the papers, flipping through them with deliberate slowness. The street was eerily quiet, the murmurs of the gathered neighbors fading into an expectant hush. The woman from the neighborhood watch stood with her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed, her confidence in her accusation unshaken. Finally, the officer straightened and turned to her. "The documents are legitimate. This is his house," he said flatly, his tone devoid of apology or acknowledgement, as though delivering bad news to a child. The woman's jaw dropped. "That can't be right," she blurted, her voice rising. "There's no way those are real. He must have faked them." Matthew's chest tightened. He had tried to stay composed, tried to hold back, but her words were the breaking point. "You're unbelievable," he snapped, his voice rising with every syllable. "You just can't accept it, can you? You've already decided I don't belong here, not because of anything I've done, but because I'm black." His words reverberated across the gathered crowd. The woman flinched but didn't back down. "That's not," she began, but Matthew cut her off. "Don't even try to deny it," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "You didn't ask questions. You didn't even consider that I might live here. You saw me and assumed I was a threat. And now, even with proof, you still won't admit you were wrong." The crowd shifted. Neighbors who had been silently watching began to look away, their faces filled with discomfort. Some exchanged uneasy glances. Others murmured softly to each other, but no one stepped forward to defend him or to condemn the accusers. Matthew turned toward the officer, his frustration boiling over. "Is that it?" he asked. "You're just going to walk away? No apology? Nothing?" The officer shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "The issue's resolved," he said curtly before walking back to his cruiser. Matthew clenched his fists as the patrol car pulled away. He turned back to the crowd, his voice softer now, but no less powerful. "This is my home," he said, his gaze sweeping over the group. "I worked hard for this. And you, every one of you, you decided I didn't belong without even knowing me. What does that say about you?" The neighbors shifted uncomfortably, some retreating into their homes, avoiding his gaze. Others lingered, their silence more damning than words. The woman from the neighborhood watch opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. For all her bravado, she had nothing to say. Matthew stood there, letting the weight of the moment sink in. The anger in his chest burned hot, but beneath it, a quiet determination began to grow. This was his home, and no amount of ignorance or prejudice would make him leave. He had proven his place here. Now it was up to them to prove they deserved to call themselves his neighbors. A few days after the incident, Matthew sat at his kitchen table, the weight of what had happened pressing down on him. The humiliation, the stares, the way his words had been ignored, it was too much to let go. He opened his laptop and began typing. His post was raw and detailed. He recounted the confrontation, the accusations, and the police treating him as though he were guilty from the start. He included photos, his deed, his ID, and even the group standing in his driveway. "This is my story," he wrote. "But it's not just mine. It's the story of anyone who's ever been treated like they don't belong, judged not by their actions, but by the color of their skin." Hitting post felt like a gamble, but within hours, his story exploded. Comments poured in, support, outrage, and similar stories of prejudice. His post quickly went viral, shared by thousands. Local news outlets picked it up, and soon, the quiet suburb was under the spotlight. Reporters called, wanting interviews. Articles with titles like "Man Confronted Outside His Own Home" spread across social media, sparking heated discussions. The Neighborhood Watch group found itself in the middle of a growing scandal. Their leader, the woman who had confronted Matthew, became the focus of public criticism. Under pressure, she held a press conference. "I deeply regret how this situation unfolded," she said stiffly. "I acted with the neighborhood's safety in mind and meant no harm." But her words felt hollow. Many saw her apology as more about saving face than admitting fault. For Matthew, the attention wasn't about shaming anyone. He wasn't looking for revenge. What he wanted was change. "If we ignore this," he said during one interview, "it'll keep happening. It's not just about me, it's about the assumptions we make and the harm they cause." Determined to create something positive, Matthew organized a meeting with his neighbors. He invited everyone, and to his surprise, many showed up. Standing before the room, he shared his story again, not with anger, but with honesty. "We all live here together," he said, scanning the room. "But the first thing you thought about me was that I didn't belong. We can't keep letting fear and prejudice decide who we think people are. We have to do better." His words sparked something. Neighbors who had avoided him days earlier now spoke openly, admitting their biases or sharing their own experiences. By the end of the meeting, Matthew proposed a bold idea, a new kind of neighborhood watch. This one would focus on community building, inclusivity, and trust. Its goal wouldn't just be to prevent crime, but to create connections across differences. The idea caught on. People signed up, and within weeks, the group transformed. They held events, organized cleanups, and created opportunities for neighbors to get to know one another. People who had once avoided eye contact were now working side by side. Though Matthew still carried the pain of what happened, he felt a sense of purpose. What began as a moment of humiliation became a catalyst for change. His story, once defined by injustice, became a symbol of hope for him and for the community that had finally started to see each other for who they truly were.